The rain drummed against the windows of Manhattan's newest architectural marvel on that Tuesday evening in November 2024. Inside the gleaming ballroom of Morrison Heights, the city's power brokers clinked crystal glasses while admiring their latest trophy, a 40-story testament to old money and older prejudices. Elena Vasquez knelt carefully between the forest of Armani suits and Louboutin heels, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, collecting fragments of a shattered champagne flute. At 28, she moved with an unconscious grace that seemed almost out of place in her burgundy cleaning uniform, each gesture precise and controlled, despite the trembling in her hands. The accident had been simple enough: a careless elbow from a society matron, a tray falling in slow motion, the inevitable crash that silenced 200 of New York's most influential voices. "Clumsy girl," someone whispered. "They should screen these people better," came another murmur. But it was the voice that boomed across the marble expanse that changed everything, cutting through the ambient noise like a blade through silk. "If she can dance a waltz without falling, I'll marry my son to her right here tonight." Charles Morrison IV, heir to a shipping fortune built on 3 generations of calculated cruelty, stood in the center of the room with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his custom tuxedo worth more than most people's cars, and his smile held the particular brand of malice reserved for those who believed wealth was synonymous with worth. The ballroom fell silent except for the soft patter of rain against glass. Elena's hands stilled among the crystal shards. Around her faces turned with the hungry anticipation of spectators at a Roman Colosseum, waiting to see which way the lions would leap. "Dad, that's enough," came a quiet voice from the edge of the crowd. Marcus Morrison, 26 and uncomfortable in his inheritance, stepped forward with the kind of reluctance that comes from watching your father's cruelty become public entertainment one too many times. But Charles waved off his son's protest with the casual dismissal of a king swatting flies. No, let me finish this thought." Charles continued, his voice carrying the theatrical flair of a man accustomed to holding court. "This young woman clearly lacks the coordination for proper cleaning. Perhaps we should test whether she possesses any grace whatsoever." Elena rose slowly, crystal fragments still clinging to her apron, her dark eyes meeting Charles Morrison's pale blue ones with something that made several nearby guests shift uncomfortably. It wasn't the deference they expected. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the slight trace of an accent that spoke of childhood in East Harlem and dreams that had once reached far beyond these gilded walls. "Are you making me an offer?" The question hung in the perfumed air like incense in a cathedral, heavy with implications none of them could yet grasp. Charles's eyes narrowed with the predatory focus of a shark scenting blood in the water. Behind him, his wife Vivian, 53 years old and Manhattan's reigning ballroom dancing champion, approached with the smile of a woman who had never met a challenge she couldn't crush beneath her Manolo Blahniks. "Darling!" Vivian purred, her voice honey over broken glass. "Surely you don't need to waste time with this little performance." But Charles was already drunk on the possibilities on the entertainment value of what he saw as certain humiliation served up on a silver platter to the most judgmental audience in America. The game was set. The players were in position. And Elena Vasquez, whose real name hadn't been spoken in these circles for over a decade, was about to remind them all that the most dangerous opponents are the ones you never see coming. Act 2. The escalation. The ballroom's crystal chandeliers caught the light differently now, as if the very air had shifted with Elena's acceptance of Charles Morrison's challenge. Conversations died mid-sentence, champagne glasses paused halfway to lips, and the city's elite found themselves witnesses to something that felt both inevitable and impossible. Play something classical. Charles commanded the string quartet, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never doubted his right to orchestrate other people's humiliation. A waltz. Something traditional. Elena stepped back from the scattered crystal, brushing her hands against her uniform with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. In the corner of the ballroom, she caught sight of a familiar face. Diego Santos, the building's head of security, a man in his 60s whose knowing eyes held recognition that made her pulse quicken. He had been there 15 years ago, working security at Lincoln Center when Elena Morales had been the most celebrated principal dancer in the American Ballet Theater's history. Before the accident, before the coma, before the world decided she was too broken to matter. Diego's slight nod told her everything she needed to know. He remembered, and more importantly, he was recording. "This is delicious," whispered Constance Whitmore, a socialite whose greatest achievement was marrying into pharmaceutical money. "I haven't seen entertainment this good since the Petersons' divorce trial." Vivian Morrison positioned herself in the center of the polished floor, executing a series of warm-up stretches designed more for show than necessity. Her movements were competent, polished by years of expensive lessons at the city's most exclusive dance studios. She moved like someone who had learned to dance in drawing rooms where technique was less important than the appearance of refinement. "Mother's quite good," Marcus murmured to Elena, genuine concern creasing his features. "She's won several amateur competitions." Elena turned to him with something that might have been gratitude if gratitude could carry such sharp edges. "Your mother dances beautifully for someone who learned it as a hobby." The distinction in her words was subtle but unmistakable. Amateur versus professional. Learned versus born. Charles rubbed his hands together with the glee of a man about to witness his favorite blood sport. "Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen. 500 says my wife finishes without breaking a sweat. 1,000 for anyone brave enough to back our guest performer." The crowd tittered with the nervous energy of people complicit in cruelty they told themselves was entertainment. Money changed hands with the casual efficiency of a stock exchange, treating Elena's dignity like a commodity to be wagered upon. "And when you lose," Charles added, stepping close enough that Elena could smell the expensive whiskey on his breath, "you'll apologize on your knees to everyone here for wasting our time. Then security will escort you out, and you'll never work in this city again." Elena met his gaze without flinching. "And when I win?" The question sparked something dangerous in Charles's eyes, the thrill of a gambler who believed the house always won. "When you win," he laughed, the sound echoing off the marble walls. "My dear girl, I said I'd marry you to my son. But since that's obviously impossible, let's make it interesting. If you somehow manage not to embarrass yourself completely, I'll give you $10,000 and a glowing reference." "That's not what you said originally," Elena replied, her voice carrying a precision that made several lawyers in the audience perk up with professional interest. Charles's smile faltered for just a moment before returning with renewed viciousness. "You want to hold me to that joke? Fine. Dance better than my wife and my son will propose to you right here tonight. But we both know how this ends." The music began, a classical waltz that Elena recognized instantly. It was Chopin's Waltz in A-flat major, the same piece she had performed at her final public appearance before the accident that stole her career and left her rebuilding her life from nothing. Vivian began to dance, her movements technically correct, but lacking the transcendent quality that separates competence from artistry. She moved through the familiar patterns of ballroom waltz, her posture perfect, her timing impeccable, her expression radiating the confidence of someone who had never faced real competition. The audience applauded politely, their appreciation genuine but measured. Vivian Morrison danced exactly as well as they expected from Manhattan's amateur ballroom champion. Then it was Elena's turn. She walked to the center of the floor, and something in her bearing shifted. The hunched shoulders of the cleaning woman straightened into the regal posture of a queen. Her head lifted with a dignity that made the very air around her seem to sparkle. The music began again, and Elena closed her eyes. For the first few measures, Elena moved conservatively, letting the audience maintain their expectations. Her steps were sure but unremarkable, her posture correct but not extraordinary. Around the ballroom, people began to relax, confident in the outcome they had purchased with their cruel laughter. But as the waltz deepened, something magical began to happen. Elena's movements flowed like water finding its natural course. Her arms carved through space with a fluidity that defied physics, and her legs moved with the controlled power of a trained athlete. This was not the stiff formality of ballroom dancing taught in expensive studios. This was poetry written in motion. Each turn was a perfect spiral, each leap a moment of suspended gravity. The cleaning woman's uniform became irrelevant, then invisible, as Elena transformed before their eyes into something that belonged in the great theaters of the world. The audience's casual chatter died away, replaced by an electric silence broken only by the music and the whisper of Elena's feet across the marble floor. "My God," someone breathed. "This is impossible," came another whisper. Charles Morrison's face had drained of color, his confident smirk replaced by something approaching terror, as he realized he was watching the systematic destruction of everything he thought he knew about power and class and the natural order of things. Elena performed a series of pirouettes that would have challenged principal dancers at the Metropolitan Opera, followed by a grand jeté that lifted her so high and held her there so long that several people gasped involuntarily. These were not ballroom moves adapted for show. This was classical ballet performed at the highest professional level, seamlessly adapted to waltz timing, with the kind of artistic innovation that takes decades to develop. In the corner, Diego Santos had positioned himself to capture not just Elena's performance, but the audience's reaction. His phone recorded Charles Morrison's mounting horror, Vivian's growing bewilderment, and Marcus's expression of wondering recognition. As the music approached its crescendo, Elena performed her signature move, a sequence she had created herself years ago, a combination of classical techniques that no one else had ever successfully replicated. It was her artistic fingerprint as unique and identifying as DNA. "Wait," said Margaret Ashford, a patron of the arts whose donations had supported the city's cultural institutions for decades. "I know that combination. I've seen it before, but where?" The realization hit her like a physical blow. "Elena Morales," she whispered, then louder. "Elena Morales." The name rippled through the crowd like an electric current. Elena Morales, the prodigy who had risen from the projects of East Harlem to become the most celebrated ballet dancer of her generation. Elena Morales, who had vanished at the height of her fame after a devastating car accident that the newspapers said had ended her career forever. Elena Morales, who had been presumed dead or at best permanently disabled. Elena Morales, who was now performing in a Manhattan ballroom with a skill that proved neither death nor disability had touched her. The music reached its final notes, and Elena finished in a pose that was simultaneously triumphant and humble, her arms extended toward the heavens, her head held high, with the quiet dignity of someone who had faced the worst the world could offer and survived with her soul intact. The silence that followed lasted an eternity. Then Diego Santos began to clap, slow and deliberate. Marcus Morrison joined him, then Margaret Ashford, then others, until the entire ballroom erupted in applause that shook the windows and brought tears to eyes that hadn't cried in years. Elena Morales. Charles Morrison whispered the name falling from his lips like a confession. Elena turned to face him, and for the first time that evening she smiled. "Ladies and gentlemen," Diego Santos called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades watching the powerful destroy the innocent. "Allow me to properly introduce Elena Morales, former principal dancer of the American Ballet Theater, winner of the Kennedy Center Honors, and quite possibly the greatest artist many of you will ever see perform." The applause continued, but underneath it ran currents of shock, embarrassment, and growing anger directed not at Elena, but at the man who had orchestrated her humiliation. Charles Morrison stood frozen in the center of his own disaster, watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Around him, the city's elite, people whose respect he had courted for decades, looked at him with expressions ranging from disappointment to disgust. "Mr. Morrison," Elena said, her voice carrying across the sudden quiet like a bell tolling midnight. "I believe we had an agreement." The words hit Charles like physical blows. His face cycled through emotions, denial, rage, desperation, before settling on the pale resignation of a man watching his empire crumble. That was a joke," he stammered. "Obviously, I never intended." "But I did," Marcus Morrison said, stepping forward with a conviction that surprised everyone, including himself. "Miss Morales, if you'll have me, I would be honored to call you my wife." The proposal hung in the air like a challenge to everything the room represented. Here was the heir to a shipping fortune, asking a cleaning woman to marry him in front of Manhattan's most powerful people. But of course she wasn't just a cleaning woman. She never had been. Elena looked at Marcus, really looked at him for the first time that evening. She saw something her years of suffering had taught her to recognize genuine goodness struggling to escape the prison of inherited privilege. "Marcus," she said gently, "you don't know me well enough to propose marriage, but I would very much like to have dinner with you sometime if you're willing to get to know Elena Morales rather than the woman who just embarrassed your father." The answer was perfect. Gracious enough to honor his courage, practical enough to respect them both. But Charles Morrison wasn't finished. Humiliation had curdled into rage, and rage demanded a target. "This is a setup," he shouted, his composure finally shattering completely. "You planned this. You came here specifically to humiliate me." Elena turned to him with the patient expression of someone explaining simple concepts to a slow child. "Mr. Morrison, I came here to clean your floors and collect a paycheck. You're the one who decided to turn my presence into entertainment. You're the one who made assumptions about my worth based on my uniform and the color of my skin. And you're the one who is now facing the consequences of your own choices. I won't be blackmailed by some has-been dancer playing dress-up as the help." The words hung in the air like poison gas, and the room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Several people took unconscious steps away from Charles, recognizing the kind of toxicity that could destroy reputations simply by association. "Mr. Morrison," Elena said, and her voice carried the weight of every humiliation she had endured. Every night she had cried herself to sleep. Every morning she had forced herself to keep living when everything she had worked for was gone. "I am not blackmailing you. I am simply holding you accountable for your words spoken publicly and recorded by multiple witnesses. You can honor your agreement like a gentleman, or you can explain to New York society why your word isn't worth the breath you used to speak it." Diego held up his phone. "The entire evening is documented, Mr. Morrison. Your challenge, your terms, your son's acceptance, and Miss Morales's extraordinary response to your cruelty." As if summoned by the promise of scandal, several people in the audience were already posting to social media. By morning, the story would be international news. Shipping heir humiliates ballet legend, then gets schooled in epic fashion. Charles looked around the room, seeing his social and business destruction reflected in the faces of people who had been his peers moments before and were now his judges. "This isn't over," he said, the threat hollow and desperate. "Yes," Elena replied with finality, "it is." 6 months later, the Elena Morales Center for Performing Arts opened in a renovated warehouse in East Harlem, not far from the housing project where she had grown up. The funding had come from an unlikely source. Morrison Shipping had donated $5 million as part of what company representatives described as a commitment to supporting the arts and addressing past oversights. The donation had been Marcus Morrison's idea, implemented during his first week as CEO after his father's forced resignation. Charles Morrison III had been quietly removed from all company leadership positions following a stockholder revolt triggered by the viral video of his public humiliation of Elena. He had since been spotted working as a consultant for a mid-level logistics firm in New Jersey, his fall from grace as complete as it was permanent. Elena stood in the center's main studio, watching a class of young dancers from the neighborhood move through their exercises. At 38, she was no longer the ethereal young woman who had once graced the world's greatest stages, but her presence in the studio was magnetic. The students, children of janitors and subway workers and security guards, moved with a hunger and determination that reminded her of herself at their age. Beautiful work, Maria, she called to a 12-year-old whose port de bras held the promise of professional grace. Remember, dance is not about perfection. It's about truth. Through the studio's windows, she could see the Manhattan skyline where she had once been humiliated and where she had chosen to reclaim not just her dignity, but her purpose. The center was more than a dance studio. It was proof that greatness could emerge from any zip code, that talent couldn't be bought or inherited, only nurtured and earned. A knock on the studio door interrupted her thoughts. Marcus Morrison stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the slightly nervous expression he always got when visiting the center, as if he still couldn't believe Elena had forgiven him for his family's cruelty. "How's class going?" he asked, offering her a cup. "They're remarkable," Elena replied, accepting the coffee and settling beside him on one of the benches that lined the studio walls. "Give them 5 years and half of them will be getting into the best dance programs in the country." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the young dancers practice combinations that would have been impossible for them to learn anywhere else. The center offered full scholarships to any student who needed them, funded by donations that had poured in from around the world after Elena's story went viral. "Any word from your father?" Elena asked, though she asked the same question every month and always received the same answer. Still in New Jersey. Still bitter. Still convinced that everything that happened was somehow unfair to him. Marcus shook his head. "My mother asked me to tell you she's sorry. She's been taking classes again, actually. Says watching you dance made her realize she'd been doing it wrong for years." Elena nodded. Vivian Morrison's apology had been one of the first to arrive after that night, handwritten on expensive stationery and delivered with a check for the center's building fund. "And us?" Marcus asked the question he'd been building up to for months. Elena considered him carefully. Over the past half-year, they had spent countless hours together, having dinner, walking through the city, talking about everything except the bizarre circumstances that had brought them together. She had discovered that Marcus Morrison was kind, funny, genuinely interested in justice, and completely unlike his father in every way that mattered. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said, smiling at his disappointed expression. "I'm still learning who Elena Morales is when she's not running from her past. But I like who I am when I'm with you." It was enough for now. More than enough. As evening fell over East Harlem, Elena watched her students pack up their dance bags and head home to families who might never have imagined their children could aspire to art as a career. Tomorrow, she would teach them about dedication. Next week, about resilience. Over the months and years to come, she would show them that the most powerful response to being underestimated was not anger or revenge, but excellence that spoke for itself. Diego Santos, who had left his security job to become the center's operations director, locked up the building as Elena and Marcus walked toward the subway together. The video he had taken that night in the ballroom had been viewed over 50 million times. But its impact couldn't be measured in clicks or shares. It had reminded the world that genius doesn't advertise itself, that dignity can't be purchased, and that the most dangerous mistake anyone can make is assuming they know someone's worth based on their circumstances. Elena Morales had lost everything once and built it back into something better. She had faced cruelty with grace, responded to humiliation with artistry, and answered hatred with the kind of love that transforms communities. And if that wasn't a happy ending, it was something even better. It was a new beginning.